Good afternoon, everybody. And good morning if you're on the West Coast. This is Christos Xenofondos. I'm the Assistant Director at the Rhode Island Department of Transportation. I'm here to welcome you as the Chair of the Transportation Pooled TPM Pooled Fund and Vice Chair of ASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management. Thank you and welcome to all of you who are joining us on the line today. This is the second webinar in our bi-monthly Transportation Performance Management, or TPM, webinar series. And this series is sponsored by the TPM Pooled Fund with support from the ASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management Leadership and FHWA. For more information on this webinar series, just visit the TPM portal at tpm-portal.com and click on TPM Webinar Series under Events in the main menu. If you have not been to the TPM portal recently, I really encourage you to visit and explore the site. There, you will find links to the video and slides from today's webinar and archived content from previous webinars. Today's webinar is also the first episode of a 5-part TPM target setting webinar mini-series that will take place during the months of July and August. Do not miss the remaining episodes. They are all must-see TV if you're in performance management. Matt Harty is definitely going to make sure of that. You can register for upcoming episodes of the target setting mini-series at the TPM portal, or watch for information in our upcoming newsletter and of course emails from Matt. If you have questions for the presenters during today's webinar or any suggestions for future webinar topics, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature. We will answer all of the questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We're looking forward to your questions and suggestions. And now I will turn it over to Matt Harty for a welcome on behalf of ASHTO. Matt?
Thanks, Christos. Hi, I'm Matt Harty. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at ASHTO. I do want to welcome everybody today. I also want to welcome those that are attending as part of the TAM mega meeting that the ASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management and the TRB Committee on Asset Management organized, that's been taking place over the past 3 days. So welcome to those that are attending as part of the TAM mega meeting. And I also, this webinar series, as Christos said, is being sponsored by the Pooled Fund. The Pooled Fund is sponsored by ASHTO in cooperation with FHWA. And again, we're sort of pleased to sponsor this webinar series, and we are very happy about the number of registrations that we got with this. We had upwards of 485. We're kind of hitting our 500 mark limit. Right now we have about 300 people on. So those are really great numbers. And I think there are a lot, well, first off, I think there's a lot of interest in target setting right now. It doesn't matter what performance management area that you're talking about, safety, asset measures, or sort of operational performance measures. There's a lot going on when it comes to, how do you establish targets. So I think it's, and also COVID-19, we're all kind of at home or in our offices, can't travel. So I think this is sort of a great way to kind of connect with everybody without, and learning something and trying to bring it back to our agency without actually having to travel. So the purpose of the webinar series in general is to support, again, the broad sort of TPM community by sharing lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge within the transportation performance management community. We're particularly happy to see so many of you joining us for our second webinar, and again, this first webinar in the mini-series today. I think you're going to enjoy today's presentation, and I hope you'll all learn a lot this afternoon. I know I'm certainly looking forward to it. And one thing that I want to add is that while this is the first of our mini-series on target setting, there's a lot going on with target setting and performance management in general. And one particular area are the safety performance measures. And for all the state DOT people out there, back in April, there was the first assessment done about making significant progress towards your safety performance measures, specifically the targets that individual state DOTs set. 27 states were determined to have made significant progress, 25 were not. That's sort of public information. AASHTO, in cooperation with that FHWA, are planning to do sort of a deeper dive of this data and this information to better understand what's going on. So when it comes to those safety performance measures, look for more information, more analysis and everything coming from AASHTO and FHWA over the next month. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yana Park of Spy Pond Partners, who's going to share our agenda for today's webinar. Yana?
Thanks, Matt. I think this is an important webinar in that it serves three purposes. First, it is the first in that mini-series that Matt and Christos have just mentioned. It is the last session, the sixth session of the TAM Mega Meeting that many of you are part of, and it's the second webinar in the TPM bi-monthly webinar series, which will be ongoing from now on every other month. So today we're going to review broad cross-cutting target setting topics, including target setting approaches and lessons learned leading up to the mid-performance period progress report. The next 4 webinars in the target setting mini-series will focus more specifically on safety, highway infrastructure, system performance, and congestion emission performance measurement areas. For the agenda today, Nelson Hoffman from Federal Highways Transportation Performance Management Team will provide an overview and federal perspective on target setting. Brian Pounds of the Massachusetts DOT will kick off our agency presentations by talking about MnDOT's performance-based planning and how they're looking back to establish a basis for the future of their capital investment program. Next, we'll hear from David Burns of the Metropolitan Council in St. Paul, Minnesota, who will talk about Met Council's coordination and collaboration with MnDOT on target setting. Following David's presentation, Matt Halbrecht from Iowa DOT will describe Iowa's risk-based target setting approach. And Tammy Haas from New Mexico DOT will wrap up our agency presentations for this webinar with New Mexico DOT's lessons learned leading up to the mid-period progress reports. Just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the Q&A feature of the webinar control panel at any time during today's presentations. And in response to the most frequently asked questions, yes, we will make the slides and video available after today's webinar at tpm-portal.com. Actually, the handouts part of the GoToMeeting webinar menu has the slides there and the agenda. Now let's get started with our presentation from Nelson Hoffman of Federal Highways. Nelson is the FHWA TPM Program Manager responsible for policy and guidance. Please join me in welcoming Nelson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. I have to say I've got a couple screens, so you're going to see my profile a couple of times. I'm going to side-eye you as we go through the presentation. So thanks again for attending, and FHW is very pleased to be cooperating on the TPM pooled fund and help make this TPM webinar series available. I'm going to set the context of target setting and an overview for the other presentations. So let's go. All right. So I've got a little bit of a delay in my slides, so I'll try to make sure that I'm talking about the slide that's on the screen. So we are in the early days of TPM target setting, and we've come a long way in just 2 years. And I know that many of you have been involved in TPM for many years, and this may not seem like an early steps, but if you look at the graphic here, we really are just in the middle of the first performance period, and though we've accomplished much, we really are just beginning. We've got a lot in front of us. So we've learned a lot, and FHWA is ready to support states and MPOs and build on the successes thus far. Lori, I was wondering if you could, I'm having some significant delay on the slide, so I was wondering if I could just ask you to advance. Okay, great. So TPM data was complete in 2018. All 52 state DOTs reported performance data and targets for each of the 17 performance measures. And this supports nationwide TPM accountability and consistency. And this was, as individually for states and MPOs and at federal highways, this was a really large and successful effort towards taking really those final steps in the process of reporting, but it really, again, was just the first steps. Next slide, please. FHWA is committed to transparency and has published the data from the first reporting period, the baseline performance report. And the website has been updated with recent data, and further updates and improvements are available. If you haven't visited this website, I strongly encourage you to do so. Look at not just your own states, but other states, and sort of see all of the vast information that is out there. And this is publicly available, and it's a very great learning tool. Next slide, please. Collaboration among all stakeholders is key to making progress. State DOTs and MPOs are working together to set data-informed targets. They're accountable for managing performance to make progress towards the targets they set. Next slide, please. FHWA supports accountability through guidance that we produce, technical assistance, and trainings, and events such as this TPM webinar series. FHWA is providing states and MPOs with TPM support since MAP 21 and the rulemaking process. And collaboration has helped improve communication, both from federal highways to states and MPOs, and then from states and MPOs back to federal highways, because we're navigating through all of these new processes together. Next slide. FHWA is hard at work to prepare for the mid-performance period progress report submission by states that's due October 1st, 2020. And if that doesn't feel like it's just around the corner, it really is. And we're finalizing the updates and improvements to the performance management form, which folks know as the PMF. And our training materials and schedule of trainings are just finalizing. In fact, hopefully we're going to be announcing something today or tomorrow. And information on this upcoming PMF training, which is going to be primarily targeted at state PMF points of contacts, and again, it should be coming out soon. Next slide, please. So, whoop, one back. All right, well, we can stay on this slide. Sorry about that. So, so earlier I had mentioned and shown the link to the FHWA State Performance Dashboard and Report website. So all of the data that's on that website is also available online at the FHWA TPM website. And it's listed as the TPM dashboard data, and there's two spreadsheets in zip files. And the next two slides are from those publicly available spreadsheets and takes a look at some trend analysis across state DOTs. Next slide, please. So this graph represents the condition and performance between the baseline and 4-year targets and whether the trend will be improving, declining, or steady. So these are the expected results from investments and policy decisions across state DOTs for infrastructure condition and system performance. And this is just for those measures where there was both the baseline reported and 4-year targets. So it's not all of the measures under these program areas, but again, this is the information that is available in the spreadsheets that are on our dashboard. Next slide, please. So this is a similar graph, and it represents the expected results and trends from investments and policy decisions across DOTs for safety performance measures. And now for safety measures, improving performance would indicate a reduction in the number and rate of fatalities or serious injuries, and declining performance would indicate an increase in the number or rate of fatalities and serious injuries. And the steady state, which is just a small percentage, would be no variance from the baseline to target. This is the analysis that is publicly available with the data and the spreadsheets. And as we're moving through the cycle, analysis will get greater and we'll learn more and excuse me, and be more explorative. But I just wanted to give a taste of the things that we're able to do. Next slide, please. We're on the TPM journey together. We each have our own roles, whether we work for the federal highways or for the DOTs or MPOs, but we all have common goals. And to that end, we look forward to seeing the next presentations. So thank you.
Thanks, Nelson. Now a reminder, if you have questions for the speakers, just enter them in the Q&A panel. And then at the end of all the presentations, we're going to be going over them and asking the panelists. For our next presentation, we're going to hear from Brian Pounds. Brian is the manager of Metropolitan Planning Organization activities for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In this role, he oversees the Commonwealth's 10 MPOs and 3 TPO regional planning activities and administers MnDOT's $8 billion state transportation improvement program. He has 16 years of transportation engineering, planning, policy, and capital investment experience in both public and private sectors. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you very much, Gianna, and thank you, Matt, and thank you, Nelson, for those great introductions. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me today. When I was developing this presentation, I thought rather than focus on data-driven efforts that I know some of my colleagues are focusing on today, I thought I'd focus a little bit more on governance, particularly how MnDOT plans for performance in the governance and how we work with our MPOs, and looking at process improvements leading into the mid-performance period. Next slide, please. So there is some animations built into this PowerPoint that I may be regretting now, Lori, so just FYI. I might say animation, you're gonna have to click. So I first want to show the basis for how MnDOT invests in our customers and assets through the lens of performance-based planning. It's important to note that MnDOT and the MBTA undertake a number of planning efforts throughout the course of a year or on a multi-year basis, one of which is updating our 5-year CIP and SIP every single year. So number one, first animation, Lori, beginning with our performance-based planning, which is the focus of our discussion today, stemming from the work that MnDOT has already conducted through our policy setting and through our various modal studies. We're using the tools at our disposal to set our performance targets by program. And this is done through MnDOT's annual performance tracker, updated across all divisions. And at this stage, that can be done with or without financial constraint to see what return we can get on our investments to reach our long-term goals. I'll discuss our performance tracker in an upcoming slide. And then, of course, we apply the financial filters, which make the program sizing and project selection competitive. And finally, we are sizing our programs and selecting our projects through our annual 5-year CIP. Next slide, please. So the publication of MnDOT's annual performance tracker is grounded in legislation which provides specific performance measures to be included in the report. In addition, our Office of Performance Management and Innovation has worked to align these measures with those that are federally mandated in the final rulemaking that was created through MAP 21, the FAST Act. So similar to the federal requirements, which are included, it includes developing 2- and 4-year targets across all MnDOT divisions, in addition to long-term targets. This allows us to more strategically size our CIP programs and select our projects through a performance-based planning approach. And the slide that's on the screen right now, something that I'm particularly reminded of in my involvement with nationwide performance-based planning efforts and through the peer exchanges that I've done with other state DOTs is what I want to focus on today. And it's the importance of governance, particularly because it just varies so much from state to state, particularly how the DOTs interact with their respective MPO boards and their regional planning agencies. So in Massachusetts, we have 13 regions, we have 10 MPOs, and 3 rural transportation planning organizations that we treat as MPOs. Something else that's rather unique is that MassDOT is the chair of each MPO through the Secretary of Transportation, and the Highway Division Administrator also has a seat on each of the MPO boards. We also have 13 regional planning agencies which conduct the important 3C planning work on behalf of the MPOs that share the same geographic area. So this really has been a benefit to us since it facilitates the policy coordination between the DOT, the MPOs, the 351 cities and towns we have, and as you can imagine, has really helped our coordination efforts in setting and adopting statewide targets. Next slide, please. So for governance across all agencies, and you can go ahead and click through the animations here, Lori. First, we receive guidance in the form of federal legislation, but I also want to note how important our relationship is with FHWA Division Office and FTA Regional Office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Their office is quite literally right across the Charles River from MassDOT headquarters in downtown Boston, and we frequently discuss performance-based planning and capital investment strategies through the regional tips and STIP. So it was really helpful in the baseline setting of our targets in 2018. Shout out to Nelson Hoffman there that helped us with that process. So in MassDOT, the main bodies for performance-based planning efforts are through our Office of Performance Management and Innovation, or OPMI, of course, the Highway Division, and the Office of Transportation Planning, in which I am employed, and I am responsible for the reporting of the targets through UPACs, just like the other state DOTs are. Again, our 13 MPOs and TPOs, of which MassDOT is the chair, but each of these regions also has an advisory committee comprised of local elected officials who also deliberate performance-based planning and capital investment strategies that they recommend to the MPO for consideration. And last but certainly not least, our 13 regional planning agencies that are essentially staffed to the MPOs. There's 2 more animations in here, Lori, I think. We also have a monthly transportation managers group, or TMG, that discusses relevant topics between MassDOT, FHWA, and FTA, and a subset of that group which exclusively discusses performance measures subcommittee that I chair. And of course, MassDOT, the Office of Transportation Planning, we also have a staff person assigned to each RPA and MPO to address specific needs relative to 3C planning, including the coordination of our statewide performance measures. Next slide, please. So now we're actually getting into how we actually set our performance measure targets. So PM1 for safety, of course, differs from the PM2 and PM3 measures in that it's updated on a calendar year basis. So the first animation here, from March through July, we are refining our methodology for target setting through MassDOT's Strategic Highway Safety Plan, utilizing available FARS reporting data, and working closely with our state partners at EOPS and our safety partners at NHTSA. In the next animation, we are setting our targets in coordination with our regional partners at the TMG Performance Measure Subcommittee group I just mentioned prior to the presentation at each respective MPO. Final animation. We are reporting targets in our regional certification activities, MassDOT's annual CIP and STIP updates, again, that we do every single year, which is kind of unique. So this target setting process is showing it for calendar year 21, but we followed the same process that we did for calendar year 18. It's been very successful for us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do this for each one, PM1, PM2, and PM3. PM1 first. What didn't work and what did work? So first off, what really didn't work that well for us is the quality of the data isn't always that great, particularly the fatality data and FARS isn't always up to date. So numbers are often changing, and it makes target setting a lot more complicated. There's also a lag in the serious data, injury data on the statewide side that's constantly changing for previous years. So that makes it a little bit of a challenge whenever we're trying to reference previous year trends and we have different serious injury numbers coming in. And of course, one question we get a lot from the regions, I'm sure other DOTs and MPOs are facing is, why should I care about a calendar year target, right? And this is already baked, meaning that you are likely not going to make a meaningful impact on that current calendar year target since the targets are already a reflection of past investments. What did work? We have a very good working relationship with our NHTSA partners that I mentioned before, so we were able to gain a consensus on targets easily. We were able to provide the data on an MPO regional level, so they didn't have to do the work for themselves. And most importantly, and I think this is true for all the performance measure target setting exercises, if in the case of them being meaningful or not, looking at safety, a calendar year versus future investment lenses, we started talking more about trends. So I think the conversation piece was a lot more important than the actual targets themselves, because we were kind of looking at where we were headed, and if we didn't change something, we were going to continue to go in those directions that we didn't want to go. Next slide, please. Consistent with many other DOTs, MassDOT largely invests in maintaining our assets in bridge and pavement conditions on the NHS. So for that reason, in the PM2 setting, it made sense for our own subject matter experts to take the lead on first convening a proposed methodology for the draft TAMP, and then consult the TMG and our RPA performance measure subcommittee and the MPOs prior to setting the baseline targets. So subsequent to the regional consultation, we then updated our performance tracker, the annual performance tracker I mentioned earlier, which is then in turn tied to our CIP TIP and STIP updates for the spring of the next calendar year. So the great thing about this cycle, the mid-performance report, is we're revisiting 4-year targets for a TAMP that we already have established when we didn't have that before. So it's going to be a little bit easier for us to convey our methodology to our regional partners, and why or why not we would be recommending to revise the 4-year targets. Next slide, please. So what didn't work for PM2? Well, first, we had somewhat of a difficult time internally translating our own performance measures on the NHS pavement system from our own Pavement Serviceability Index, or PSI, versus the federally required International Roughness Index, or IRI, but also being able to convey that translation to our RPA and MPO regional partners. Also, the fact that we had to establish the methodology first for the draft TAMP and assume investment without a long-term investment plan also presented itself with its own range of challenges. And the fact that we got MPO input a little bit later than what we'd have liked certainly wasn't desirable, although we did get feedback from the RPAs and TMG subcommittee on performance measures. So for what did work, again, partnership, our regional partnership, that governance structure really helped us out. Our regional liaisons making the presentations. Also, the fact that MassDOT largely invests in the pavement and bridge projects on the NHS really helped us with the MPO partners for them to lean on us for target setting exercise. And again, I just want to note that relationship with our FHWA division office. Next slide, please. So similar to the PM2 target setting, MassDOT convened a working group to establish reliability targets, which included hiring a consultant to assist with the calculation of LOTTR, TTTR, and PHED measures in consultation with our adjacent state DOT partners in New Hampshire within the Boston UZA. So once these draft measures were established and methodologies, we again consulted with our TMG and performance measure subcommittee groups, which facilitated our MPOs to adopt the statewide targets in 2018, leading into the certification updates in late 2018 and spring 2019. And right now, once again, we have begun those conversations with our regional partners leading up to MPO consultation in September prior to the UPACS reporting. This year, however, we will be using the CatLab British tool that many of you may be well aware of and using now to assist us in developing our reliability and PHED measures. Next slide, please. So what worked and what didn't on PM3? So starting off with what didn't work so well, we only really had one valid data point from the NPM-RDS data set that was using INRIX data. Since prior to 2017, the HERE data that NPM-RDS used provided some wildly different calculations for us in terms of reliability and PHED. Secondly, defining what reliability actually meant and distinguishing that between congestion for both our leadership within MassDOT and our regional partners was certainly a challenge. And finally, the emissions for Massachusetts, we have 5 site-specific non-attainment areas. And if CMAQ projects weren't in those areas, the targets were null, which was kind of odd for us. And now looking at what did work, again, governance, I'm going to reiterate that partnership we have with our MPOs. Using the consultant for the baseline was certainly helpful, even though we're going a different direction this time with CatLab. And finally, providing that LOTTR, TTTR, and PHED target broken down by MPO so that each region could see a piece of their pie when they were looking to adopt a statewide target. So they knew that they weren't adopting a statewide target that was equating exactly to what was happening in the region. Next slide, please. So what are we, MassDOT? What are we looking to change for future target setting, forecasting, data governance, et cetera? We'll start first off with safety. We kind of struggle with the transparency of safety data and coordinating with the RPAs on data collection, particularly for non-motorized modes. So moving forward, while we recognize the next few years will be more complicated trying to predict the VMTs due to COVID impacts and the resulting data that's going to come from that. Along with our MPOs, we're actively seeking to improve our data collection efforts, particularly on bicycle and pedestrian VMT counts, continuing to analyze crash clusters and counts that include both motorized and non-motorized modes. And then we've also created an online interactive tool for the regions to access, so they're easily navigable for our regional partners and our municipalities. For the NHS, we certainly had challenges with that translation that I mentioned from PSI to IRI. We also had some challenges with the financial planning that was done in silos. But now that we have that approved TAMP, our coordination efforts with our MPO partners will certainly be much more easier and transparent, in addition to having improved our financial forecasting alongside our FHWA division office partners. And finally, for reliability, the lack of data, particularly that using only one NPM RDS data point to constantly use to set targets for the baseline certainly was a challenge for us in 2018, in addition to doing those manual calculations. So this year, we will have more data points through INREX, and we are going to be using that CatLab RITIS tool to set reliability measures alongside our RPA partners. Next slide, please. So this slide shows in a perfect setting the flow of our policy, strategic plans to the perennial CIP program sizing and project selection. Lori, there's 2 quick animations in here if you just want to click them up there. Thank you very much. Strategic plans first set off the overarching policy goals of the agency, which are then filtered through the respective modal plans. MassDOT then uses the modal plans to assess needs and priorities, which influence the target setting exercises in MassDOT's annual performance tracker. Then our Office of Performance Management and Innovation works with each division to determine plans for performance, measure adjustments, both short-term and long-term. And then these targets directly influence the size of our programs using our planning for performance tools and give us a temperature on where we move the targets to our long-range goals within the window of the 5-year CIP. And next slide. And with that, that's my presentation today. I really look forward to your comments and questions at the conclusion of my colleagues presenting today.
All right, thank you, Brian, for a great presentation. For our next presentation, Dave Burns from the Metropolitan Council of Twin Cities in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dave works as a senior highway planner at the Met Council, where he leads the council's TPM and target setting activities. Prior to joining the council, Dave worked at the Fargo-Moorhead Metropolitan Council of Governments, the Florida Department of Transportation, and as a consultant. Take it away, Dave.
All right, sorry about that. Had a little bit of technical difficulty here, but can everyone see me and hear me well?
Yes, we can do both.
Great, thank you. Again, my name is Dave Burns. I work as a senior highway planner at the Metropolitan Council of Governments. Sorry, at the Met Council in St. Paul. And I want to talk a little bit and provide some background about the Met Council. So the Met Council functions as more than just the MPO for the region. In fact, it serves a variety of functions. We're the primary regional planning agency for the 7-county metro region, and we ensure that development occurs in an orderly manner. We operate the largest housing redevelopment authority in Minnesota and administer programs like Section 8 housing for dozens of communities. And I'm sorry, can you go forward a slide? Okay, I'll get this. the Met Council actually partners with park agencies to develop and maintain a regional park system with 55 regional parks. In addition, our Environmental Services Division operates a system of wastewater treatment plants and ensures that the region's lakes and rivers are clean and remain clean. The council owns and operates Metro Transit, which is one of the leading transit systems in the nation. And most importantly for this conversation, we serve as the NPO for the region. And as a TMA, we are responsible for the competitive solicitation of funds for transportation projects, a process which we call the regional solicitation. Next slide, please. Okay, actually, one slide back. I'm not sure what's, sorry. There we go. Okay, as background, I want to provide a bit of history on the use of performance measures at the council. As you might imagine, the use of TPM is not a new concept to the council. In fact, we do have a long history of using data and measures to better inform our investment decisions and track our progress in meeting the vision for the region. The federal performance measures were integrated within the existing performance-based planning and programming framework, making it a rather seamless process. In 2014, we adopted Thrive, which is a long-term 30-year plan for the region. Thrive addresses more than just transportation. It's the overall regional development guide for the Twin Cities metro area. During the process of developing Thrive, the council gathered input from stakeholders and outlined 5 desired outcomes for the region for the year 2040. Those being stewardship, prosperity, equity, livability, and sustainability. Thrive produces the major goals for the region, and transportation plays a vital role in achieving all of these desired outcomes. Next slide, please. Thrive serves, as I said, as a vision for all the council's family of plans, including our MTP, which we call the Transportation Policy Plan, or TPP. So due to the unique nature of our agency and our broad functions, our transportation-related system performance goals have been broadly woven into an overall long-term planning vision for our region. In the TPP, we identified 6 overarching transportation-related goals for the region. Those being transportation system stewardship, safety and security, competitive economy, healthy and equitable communities, and leveraging transportation investments to guide land use. Now, each of these goals have a number of related performance measures, which are reported upon right now in the performance outcomes chapter of our transportation policy plan. This chapter is constructed to outline and report upon both the federally required performance measures and their adopted targets, as well as our regional performance measures, which were chosen to reflect and evaluate the region's progress towards achieving the long-term vision outlined by the plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the performance outcomes chapter of the TPP, as I mentioned, includes performance measures that are categorized by the overall goals of the TPP. Now, in the TPP, we use scenario planning and report upon the results within the performance outcome chapter of the document. In this chapter, we outline the current system performance as well as the modeled outcomes of the performance measures based upon 3 scenarios where it is applicable. An example of this is shown in the table on the bottom left of the screen. So we have access to jobs and a min-pass usage. So the current revenue scenario is the modeled scenario that assumes that all revenues that the region can reasonably expect to be available will continue to be available at the same level until the horizon year of 2040. The increased revenue scenario is premised on the idea that the region may adopt policy changes, laws, or decisions that increase local, state, or federal funding levels. Finally, the no-build scenario is a bit of a worst-case scenario. It is the model conditions of the region under the assumption that no projects are built after the 2015 base year condition. So it's maybe a little bit tough to see, but you can kind of see the difference in the access to the number of jobs within 30 minutes under the increased revenue scenario and the no build scenario, and certainly it is significant. So the performance outcomes chapter also integrates the federal performance measures, an example of which is shown on the right. Those are our PM1 safety performance targets for 2020 and our PM2 adopted targets. Next slide, please. Just real briefly, this is a screenshot from our Thrive dashboard, which currently includes a number of transportation performance measures related to the 5 outcomes of the region as described in Thrive. And as I mentioned, we intend to expand this greatly in the future to report upon all the federally required measures, as well as the regional performance measures adopted and reported in our transportation policy plan. Next slide, please. So our TPP provides the strategic direction for the target setting process. It is based upon the region's vision for the future and guides both the planning and programming processes. Performance measures provide the ability to track our progress towards meeting this vision. The federally required performance measures, which are shown here, as you all probably know very well, are integrated seamlessly within the vision and thus throughout the TPM process. Ultimately, the outcomes of the desired vision are reflected in the projects that are funded through our regional solicitation process and included within our TIP produced annually. Next slide, please. Okay, I am going to touch upon coordination with MnDOT. So coordination between agencies is essential for an effective performance-based planning and programming approach. MnDOT and the Council both understand that we all contribute to the statewide objectives as articulated in MnDOT's statewide multimodal transportation plan. The image on the right outlines MnDOT's PBPP approach and emphasizes that we are all partners in achieving this vision. Overall, MnDOT proved to be an excellent partner in the establishment of federal performance measure targets. They regularly communicated the rationale for the statewide targets and provided ample opportunity for input. This was done both via meetings with MPOs to discuss individual performance measures, for example, PM2 measures, and they also provided data to the MPOs to assist in establishing performance measure targets specific to the MPO boundary. Importantly, they provided data that was provided, like I said, at the MPO level, which greatly assisted in establishing regional targets. Other things that MnDOT did, they hosted a TPM workshop for MPOs and other partners. I believe this was a multi-day workshop, and it was very informative. And just one last thing I'd like to mention in regards to coordination with MnDOT. As a region, the region was a CMAQ maintenance area in 2018, and thus were required to jointly set CMAQ targets. So this was accomplished through a series of meetings hosted by MnDOT and attended by both MnDOT and Council staff. We successfully set targets for the region in really a harmonious process. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about the safety performance targets. So while the Council chose to support the statewide targets for PM2 and PM3 performance measures, we took a slightly different approach for the safety performance targets. Safety performance measures were initially set by the state in August of 2017. At that time, the council chose to use the methodology MnDOT used to set the statewide safety performance targets, but applied to the specific metro area numbers in order to set the target. So, for example, for the initial safety targets, which were for year 2018, we used the MnDOT methodology to develop targets for the metro area. So their methodology was to apply a 3% annualized reduction from the 2015 base year data for fatalities and a 5% reduction for serious injury crashes. However, safety performance and rates are significantly different in the metro area than the rest of Minnesota. For example, fatal and serious injury crash rates are much lower in the metro area than statewide, and bike ped crashes are higher in the metro area. So by the time 2019 rolled around and we started to set the 2019 targets, we again choose to apply the MnDOT methodology to the metro area data. This happened to result in a substantial increase in our fatality and serious injury targets from 2018 to 2019. As an example, in our 2019 targets rose from 89 in 2018 to 109 in 2019. This was certainly noticed by our stakeholders and really ultimately communicated the wrong message. So when it came to set the 2020 targets, we understood we needed to adopt a different approach. For 2020, we essentially froze the process, reused the 2019 targets for 2020. In essence, we made no change. Next slide, please. After setting the 2020 targets, we knew we needed to approach the target setting process differently. So we decided to take a step back, and through discussion with our technical and policy committees, we decided to establish a safety advisory committee whose task will be to help set these regional safety targets. This will ensure we have a regionally agreed upon approach that reflects the vision of the region and sets targets that we as a region will work to attain. Next slide, please. Just a couple of notes for conclusion. Overall, the federal performance measures build upon our established performance-based planning and programming approach and framework and assist in ensuring we are on track to meet our established regional vision. MnDOT has been an invaluable partner in the target setting process, and they provide key data and facilitate coordination. MnDOT understands that we are planning partners and that thus are essential in achieving the statewide vision. And as I mentioned, the safety target setting process proved problematic, will be corrected in the future, and really kind of served as an interesting example of issues that we had in the process. So thank you very much. I look forward to taking your questions at a later time.
Thanks, Dave. I learned some things in your presentation, so that was great. Next, we have Matt Hobrook joining us from the Iowa DOT. Matt is the Transportation Asset Management Administrator at Iowa DOT. He serves as the chair for the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management. I think many of you who are part of the mega meeting that this is a part of know that he's one of our hosts. And so, by the way, also at the end of this webinar, the closing session for the mega meeting will continue, so all of you are welcome to stay for that. Matt also chairs the implementation subcommittee of the TRB Asset Management Committee and is a member of the TRB Transportation Visualization Committee. Matt has been involved in numerous national conference planning committees and NCHRB panels and is the U.S. representative to the PR Technical Committee on Asset Management. He's been with the Iowa DOT since 2010. I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Jana. And yes, I'm coming to you from Iowa, not from the DOT, but from my basement. But it's a nice place to be today. So appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be with you all here today. As Hiana mentioned, we were fortunate to have this particular webinar kind of already scheduled, and we were able to kind of incorporate it into the mega meeting, TAM mega meeting agenda that we've had here for the past 3 days. I know for many of you maybe didn't have a chance to attend some of those sessions. That may be a little out of the blue, but I really encourage you to stick around afterwards. We're going to be kind of talking a little bit about some of the highlights from the mega meeting, and many of the materials that were presented and discussed will be available, and you're welcome to peruse those as they pertain to your particular interests or role. So, Lori, am I controlling this, or do you? There we go. Okay, next slide. Thank you. You know, we're thinking a little bit about this whole TPM performance measures and targets framework. You know, the idea for us of setting targets and using them is not new. We've had a performance-based budgeting process since I came to state government in the early 2000s. I was with a different agency at the time, but we've had requirements to do performance-based budgeting and kind of target setting. But I think, you know, over time that there were some shortcomings in what we've seen and how it's been incorporated. And I think what was really missing in a lot of cases was a kind of a transparent evaluation of the likelihood and consequence that were associated with some of these measures. And that's not the only thing missing, but you know, I'm going to kind of focus my remarks today on those issues. So, Lori, next slide, please. So kind of setting the stage, you know, one of the things I wanted to pick up, and I think a couple of the, both Brian and David kind of mentioned this earlier, is that a lot of the TPM targets that we're asked to look at are, at least in the context of a transportation network, are relatively short term. I mean, we're talking in the PM1, mostly about 1-year targets based on the 5-year rolling average, of course. They have the 2- and the 4-year targets for the other, for PM2 and PM3. And, you know, they're kind of looking at data that in some cases, you know, part of it, the data has even already been collected. And we're really looking at how we can influence data that maybe has already been collected or is for relating to projects that have already been programmed, right? So we think about 2-year targets, we are basically already letting projects right now that are going to influence the data that's collected next year on our system, and so we have very limited ability to kind of impact the direction of those targets on the timescales that we're talking about. And don't misunderstand me, I am not arguing for trying to make these targets longer term. I think it's would be sort of silly to try to say, hey, let's set a target for 10 years from now and try to evaluate ourselves against a 10-year from now target. I think that we do need to go with these relatively short-term targets, but I think it gives us a little bit of a, from my perspective anyway, and where we kind of tumbled to, is a little bit of a different perspective on the time scale of these targets and kind of how we would go about looking at them. We found that at least in the short term, that these targets are related to that sometimes the best predictor of performance is the recent past. So next slide, please. So our approach in general, we have some technical teams working on each of these measure areas, safety, pavement, bridge, and mobility. And really each of those teams we're focusing on using very simple, straightforward time series or trend type models. We do try to confirm those results with management systems where it's applicable, but we found that at least in the short term, it's relatively straightforward to create a projection model that is based purely on the trend. And the nice thing about these particular models is it gives us the ability to kind of construct what I call the cone of confidence, sort of the future level of accuracy or of prediction accuracy that we can anticipate based on the variability that's inherent in the process. So it's kind of a statistical model. I'm have some training in statistics, and in fact was working on a second master's in business analytics at the time that all of this stuff came out, and that probably influenced some of my thinking in relation to putting this together. But we really, I think, have a lot of benefits that result from the approach that we take in thinking about this in terms of a time series approach and looking at the confidence levels. So our technical teams are really not there to kind of debate the numbers. I mean, the example I like to use is like, we're not sort of trying to prognosticate about the number of fatalities or serious injuries that we're going to have next year. I mean, there's a lot of noise in that process, and trying to come up with the number is it's a challenge, and it's one that I think is kind of can lead you in the wrong direction. I mean, we're not trying to get the exact number. What we're trying to get to is we're trying to think about what is the overall trend that we're observing in our system. Are we making investments that help move things in the direction that we would like to see them move? And let's think about the consequences of failing to meet these targets. In the very specific sense of the consequences to the agency in terms of failing to meet the targets, but in the broader sense also of impacts to the public of targets not being met. So next slide, please. So we kind of came to this approach, and I think Brian talked about it a little bit earlier, that we have had some of these items there where you only had a single data point, like for example on the some of the mobility measures for system performance and freight. We just didn't have the richness of data that might allow us to build like a real trend model. When you have 1 year's data, you can't really build a trend. But what we tried to do is try to look and try to understand what we could about how how much natural variance there is in these processes or in these measures, and try to incorporate that into our target setting approach using an approach called bootstrapping. And on the other side, where we did have trend, and that kind of looking at these two green boxes that are in the middle of the page here. So we had the method on the left, which is really building that trend-based model, and we were able to use that for safety and bridge. But then we didn't have the history of data on the pavement and the PM3 side, and so that we had to take a little bit of a different approach too. I will say for a second on pavement, it may seem a little odd that we didn't have history on pavement because we've been doing automated distress collection in Iowa on our entire system for 20 plus years. But when it came to the details of the federal performance measure for PM2 for pavement, there were some gaps that we had in the way that we had collected the data in the past that didn't conform to the federal requirements, and the process that we would have had to go through to kind of make that data match the federal requirements would have was not an investment that we were able to make at the time. So relatively limited data there, and kind of had to find an alternate approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But let's start out, next slide please, talking about the trend-based approach that's kind of in those two on the left-hand side of that chart I was just showing. And so what we would do is basically take our trend. In this case, we're looking at the number of fatalities, serious injuries in this case, looking at the number of serious injuries over time. The black line represents the actual data as was observed over time. The red line is a time series based model, so it's an integrated moving average model. And the little dots are our projections into the future. And then those two blue lines that you see are the kind of cone of confidence. So basically, if we want to say how confident are we in being able to achieve this target, if we want to be 95% confident, we need to be less than or excuse me, greater than the lower bound there that is shown as the bottom blue line. So, that kind of gives us a sense of, not only what do we expect the trend to be, but how confident are we in that given the natural variability in the process. This one has a pretty wide cone of confidence, and you might say, wow, those are some really wide area. And think about this is also a 95% confidence interval, so a prediction interval, I should say. And so what we're looking at here is the blue lines represent being very confident in the result, being kind of within that bound. If we look at the next slide, Then this one is looking at the fatality rate, and this moves around a lot. Ooh, go back one, please. This looks at the fatality numbers, and they move around a lot more. You know, the scale is obviously much different than on the previous slide, but we see these some peaks and valleys. And in this case, we're doing the 75% prediction interval. And so you can see that in some cases, there's been some recent spikes that would have been outside of that level of confidence. And you would expect that. I mean, we would expect if a 75% prediction interval, that 1 out of 4 years, we would have a data point that would fall outside of that prediction interval. So this is an analysis that we have done to try to help us understand the natural variability and kind of the likelihood of being able to achieve the target levels that we're looking at setting. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, there is we had to kind of take 2 different approaches. In the one case, we were able to use a time series approach and develop that prediction interval into the future based on the model. In this case, this chart happens to be kind of a synthetic, what I call a bootstrap data set that's based on for the PM3 measures. And in this case, we just didn't have the data, and so we had to kind of make some estimates of what we would expect in terms of variability. We used a tool called At Risk from an organization called Palisade. It's a Excel plugin that allowed us to kind of do a simulation approach and basically to look at the monthly data and try to get a sense of how much month-to-month variance there was, and then try to apply that to the annual data as kind of a standard deviation. And then we could then set a confidence or prediction level based on the natural variability that we are observing on the monthly level, which of course, you know, I think is probably not the best predictor of the annual variance, but it's all we had. And so we kind of went with that, applied it to the annual number. We're going to be redoing this analysis this year now that we have a little bit more data, but we still only have 3 years of data to use, and so it's really not enough for us to be able to construct any kind of a time-based model. But at least it gets us a little bit more information about the variance that we can expect, and better informs kind of how much risk we are willing to take on with respect to kind of missing these targets. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about the modeling and kind of what's our probability of achieving various target levels. We also want to talk about the consequences. So what level of confidence do we need to consider given the consequences that we are expecting to observe? And what are those consequences if we should fail to achieve the targets? So next slide, please. We kind of put together this table that really laid out all 3 of the measure regimes, PM1, PM2, PM3, and in particular, looking at the consequences that are listed in that column on the right. And this was used to help in a conversation with leadership about what these targets are, what the consequences are of failing to achieve significant progress on the targets, and help us kind of think about how much confidence do we want to have in being successful in achieving the target values that we're setting. And it's particularly in the circumstance where there are some significant other consequences, external consequences that are not indicated here, such as what David brought up about the messaging around the safety numbers, and also around the condition numbers. If we set targets around system mobility that says we're going to get worse, it may, you know, we may find folks that use that as an argument to argue in favor of capacity expansion that may not necessarily have as much of an impact on that objective as we might like. And a lot of our congestion, at least in a rural state like Iowa, is not coming from recurring sources, but really from non-recurring sources. So next slide, please. So really, when it came to implementation, we had our first group working on this was working on the safety targets. They kind of gravitated towards this 75% confidence level, saying, you know, we would expect that about 1 out of 4 times we're going to miss these targets. And so as we look at that sort of cone of confidence, we've gravitated towards that 75% level, and we've used that as our starting point for all the other measures, and the other teams, technical teams, have kind of followed suit on that. It seemed to be in a level at which our leadership was relatively comfortable given the consequences. And you know, this really gave us the opportunity to have that sort of risk conversation with our leadership. What are the consequences of failing to meet these measures? How confident do they want to be that we're going to be able to achieve them? And you know, we're at the technical team level having those conversations every year, as particularly in the safety world, well, when we're reviewing these, about the confidence levels. And you know, not so much about the specific numbers. We're not focused on the numbers. We're focused more on, you know, what's the target value? How confident are we of achieving a target value that we're establishing, and are we really comfortable with that level of confidence that we're ascribing there? And you know, so we've had some experiences where we've had some pushbacks, some folks saying, hey, you know, these numbers, I don't know, they look pretty aggressive to me. I'm concerned that we may miss it. And then we have that conversation, and we talk about the process, and ultimately, you know, kind of circle back to, you know, maybe the numbers aren't perfect, but you know, they're helping us make progress, right? And to better understand, you know, what the short-term performance of our system is likely to look like. Okay, next slide. So I'm not going to say that this doesn't have a few issues. I think the biggest one is really that it doesn't rely on our management systems. So it's not really firmly linked to our TAMP and our planning documents, as you know, as much as it might be preferred. And you know, to my mind, as I mentioned earlier, and I kind of, as I continue to argue, that you know, this really reflects the time intervals that we're looking at. You know, in our TAMP, other documents, we are setting our state of good repair based on what we look at as a 10-year projection of the investments that we're going to make, or that we plan to make, and the strategies that we intend to use. And so, you know, over that kind of a time horizon, we can kind of build the trend that we're working towards. But when we're talking about a 2-year target, you know, as I mentioned earlier, those investments have already been decided. We are not going to be moving the needle on our 2-year targets for sure. And even the 4-year targets with a system as large as ours, it would take a tremendous swing in investment in order to have an impact within the 4-year time horizon on these targets. We just have, you know, most DOTs have a large enough system and have the ability to impact small enough parts of it every year in terms of their investment capacity, that it, you know, I think it makes sense to think about using the management systems and the TAMP and those processes for more of the longer term approach, and kind of setting the goal and moving in that direction. And really the short-term targets that we're talking about are very difficult to adjust on that, or very difficult to address through investment in the short term. This also does require a little bit of modeling know-how, and you know, that's also an issue. And you know, we have to also assume that the past predicts the near future, and you know, that's certainly something that hasn't been a huge question mark in the past. But you know, as we're finding this year with the pandemic and a lot of the different shifts that we're seeing in travel patterns, it could be the case that that assumption is violated. And so, you know, those are all issues that we need to continue to look at. But overall, I think that we've got a lot of buy-in to this process. We found it to be very valuable for our agency, and in particular, and having that conversation with leadership about the consequences and the probability of achieving targets, and really having a more risk-centered conversation about our target setting approach. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. You can see my picture here is a little dated. I've grown, as I've been locked in the basement here, I haven't been shaving. So thanks for the time here today.
Thanks, Matt. I can't wait to hear what Iowa does, you know, in the future as you evolve on your target setting approach. So wrapping up our great set of presentations today, we're going to hear from Tammy Haas from the New Mexico Department of Transportation. Tammy is a civil engineer with more than 30 years of experience in transportation engineering and management. She has served the New Mexico DOT in numerous capacities and currently serves as the New Mexico DOT Division Director for Capital Program and Investment Division. Tammy also brings federal experience as she spent over 10 years working for the Federal Highway Administration. Over the course of the past 2 decades, she's become one of the leading practitioners in transportation asset management. Tammy currently is a member of the TRB Standing Committee on Strategic Management and serves on several NCHRP project panels related to asset management and performance management. Now let's hear from Tammy.
Thank you, Yana. As I was thinking about what I was going to present today, it made me think about when New Mexico DOT's journey really started and how that early work really related to performance management as it is today. I guess the first time in my career that I can pinpoint when I was introduced to performance management was when I was working for the Federal Highway Administration prior to transitioning to my career with New Mexico Department of Transportation. Back then, we used the term total quality management. Then that transitioned to the National Quality Initiative. In the mid-90s, MnDOT created their first performance measures that were updated on a quarterly basis, and we had regular quarterly meetings to discuss those measures as we were chasing quality awards. As administrations changed and cabinet secretaries changed, our focus has also changed. Through our legislative process, we have some performance measures and targets included in our budget bill each year, and we are required to report our progress on a quarterly basis. On a state level, we report on safety, pavement, and bridge, which relate to PM1 and PM2. My focus today will be on our PM2 and our TAMP. Next slide. With the passage of MAP 21, now all DOTs are required to create an asset management plan that covers at least our national highway system pavements and bridges, and we need to include performance measures and targets into it. For some of us, this became a huge learning curve on a short time period. I was suddenly cast into the role of the MnDOT expert on asset management and all of the items that needed to be included in our first TAMP. Also, I was looked at as the person that needed to provide the education to other MnDOT staff that would be involved in the TAMP. At that time, our performance measures manager was also on my team, and we decided that transportation performance management was going to be our responsibility. The good news was that we already had our bridge measure, and we were reporting on pavement performance as part of our state budget requirements. Next slide. I think that one of the benefits to measuring performance is that our performance measures tell our story about the condition of our assets. And when we look at the measures in PM2 for pavement and bridge conditions, we need to know about our inventory. Setting targets helps provide direction as to where we want to go. Our TAMP helps to provide the direction based on reasonably available funding forecasts on how we can get there to achieve those targets that we set. As you all know, we need to determine our percent good and percent poor in order to set our baseline performance, and we all had to submit that to FHWA in 2018. Next slide. One of the first things that I think a lot of us were doing was figuring out what type of information or data that we needed for our TAMPs. I think that all of the states have some form of graphic or table in their TAMP that actually shows the inventory and condition of their assets. For New Mexico DOT, putting this chart together and showing the information by district was probably the first time we looked at our pavement data this way. We were looking at our bridge conditions by district, but maybe not showing all 6 districts information on bridge conditions side by side. Our donut chart can be updated each year as we have our new data, and we were asked by our FHWA division office to provide a new chart with the 2019 data collection as part of our demonstration of implementation for the consistency review this year. So this chart actually happens to be our 2019 data. Next slide. So where are we going? Our biggest challenges with implementing the requirements for PM2 and linking with our TAMP was really understanding the federal requirements. We had all of the data, but our pavement management system combined the pavement distress and condition data into our formula that looked nothing like the PM2 pavement measures formula for determining the good, fair, and poor that FHWA included in the final rule. We didn't want to reconfigure our pavement management system to predict future conditions based on the FHWA measures because we thought that treating the 3 different metrics, actually there's 4 if you have concrete pavement, but when you look at the rutting and faulting, cracking, and IRI, those 3 items are actually treated equally in the FHWA measure, and that was not aligned with our pavement management system configuration. Our pavement management system computes an overall condition index that takes into account the various distresses through our structural, safety, and environmental indices. And we didn't believe that the IRI should have as much emphasis in our pavement condition rating. We developed a methodology working with our condition based on the pavement management or the pavement condition rating and how we crosswalk it to the FHWA measure for good, fair, and poor. My focus today is not on the differences between our pavement measure and FHWA's, but more on the challenges with setting targets for a DOT to implement with asset management and the collaboration, training, and marketing that was needed in setting those targets that we would be able to show progress in meeting those targets through an asset management approach. Next slide. So we all know this slide. These are really just kind of the summary of the ranges of how you determine whether you're good, fair, or poor. In 2013, we started collecting the full extent of our national highway system pavements through our contract for automated pavement data collection. When we started looking at the 23 CFR 490 requirements for pavement, we were very happy that we actually had all of the data, but it meant that we were going to have to look at the data in our pavement management system in a different way in order to be consistent with the requirements. Next slide. So we were using an Excel spreadsheet so that we could develop a historical graph of our percent good, fair, and poor based on the federal metrics. The challenge becomes in determining future condition over a 10-year period. We will continue to maintain this particular graph to track our past performance for national highway system pavements. Next slide, please. In order to determine our future condition, we use the data from our pavement management system using our funding allocations identified in our April 2018 TAMP for the interstate and the non-interstate NHS. This required separate modeling and then entering information into an Access database in order to crosswalk our future pavement condition rating to the FHWA good, fair, and poor metrics. This graph is shown. This graph shown is the one that we use to develop the 2-year and 4-year targets that are actually in our TAMP. And these were the targets that were submitted in the base performance report in October of 2018. Each year, we can take the current pavement condition data using the federal measures and show our percent good, fair, and poor pavements to verify whether or not we are on track to meet the 2- and 4-year performance targets, since we use the 2016 collected data as our base condition level when we actually ran the model to set the targets. Next slide. We prepared a PowerPoint presentation that covered inventory and condition for both bridge and pavement condition, the MAP 21 requirements, including the need to use bridge and pavement management systems, the asset management rule, 23 CFR 515, and a detailed review of the 23 CFR 490 requirements, including each of the measures. The charts in the previous slides were part of that district PowerPoint. Our districts are pretty familiar with bridge metrics, but getting the districts to use our pavement management system has been a little bit more of a challenge and a learning curve that we still need to focus on. In New Mexico, the districts have been responsible for programming projects in the STIP based on funding allocations, and there hasn't really been a lot of direction or oversight from our headquarters office on programming the STIP. However, because we have had a focus on improving our percentage of bridges being structurally deficient, now we know that's considered to be in poor condition, the districts use that bridge data and input from our headquarters office on bridge treatments when they program their STIP, and as a result, since 2009, we've reduced our percent structurally deficient from over 13% statewide down to about 5% in poor condition. We continue to try to use different ways to replicate our bridge results into pavements as part of implementing our TAMP in order to get a greater buy-in of the asset management approach with our districts. Next slide, please. I know that this slide, you can't read this. It's really more just to demonstrate that we put together our white paper after meeting with all of our districts on target setting. The type of information included on page 1 covers the purpose of the white paper, and that purpose is to document the MnDOT procedures used to develop the performance targets. It also defines the performance targets, and then the document also shows the outreach efforts completed in order to establish our targets. On page 2, the document also indicates that our performance targets are dependent on funding, as well as documents that MnDOT use the feature and condition analysis from our pavement management system based on our pavement condition rating, as I talked about earlier. This is followed on page 3 with a narrative of the bridge funding levels used to predict our future bridge condition using a spreadsheet tool, since we hadn't implemented the prediction models in the BRM, our bridge management system. We also spelled out that we use 2016 data as our basis for predicting future condition levels, and that the target years are 2019 and 2021 for our 2- and 4-year targets respectively. Those are the years in which the data is collected, so that when we do our future performance reporting, there is a lot of confusion about what data collection year was going to be assigned to the target. And that was more linked to the data when it's submitted to FHWA, either through the National Bridge Inventory or HPMS. The table at the bottom of page 3 is really a table that was incorporated into our TAMP and updated in the June 2019 TAMP. This document was shared with the MPOs for use in educating their policy boards in order to support the MnDOT targets, or whether or not they were each of the MPOs was going to adopt their own target. As we move to the next slide, this is an example of a chart that we prepared for the Santa Fe MPO. We have 5 MPOs in New Mexico. We prepared similar charts for interstate and non-interstate NHS for each MPO, as well as a bridge condition chart for each of those MPOs. The challenge we found with working with our MPOs on the target setting is that none of our MPOs has a pavement or bridge management system, and they don't collect any of the data. MnDOT made a decision to collect all of the pavement data for 100% of the national highway system every year. And we also conduct all of the bridge inspections for all of the bridges in the state. So far, only one of the MPOs has requested the pavement or bridge data on an annual basis, and that is our largest MPO that represents the Albuquerque Metropolitan Planning Area. There are several local governments in each of our MPOs that collect pavement data, and they also have their own pavement management programs. However, they typically use a PSR rating, and a lot of them are using the PASSER program for it. And the data that they collect is really not in the same format that's required for HPMS, or that can be easily implemented or inserted into our pavement management system to use to program. In New Mexico, a very small percentage of our NHS is actually locally owned, so that's why it's not really a significant burden for us to collect all the data. The MPOs also expressed that they did not have the staff available to analyze the data, so New Mexico DOT decided to provide guidance from our pavement management team, our bridge management team, as well as working with our district staff to educate each of the MPOs on pavement and bridge conditions in order to set their targets. As we go to the next slide about some of our lessons learned, during our journey to develop our TAMP, set performance targets, as well as implement our TAMP, we've realized that it is a continuous improvement process. We learned along the way that TAMP and TPM are interrelated. As I started this discussion, New Mexico DOT has been on a long journey with continuous improvement through measuring our performance. I feel like we were once a leader, but maybe fell off the wagon for a little while. And now with TPM, we're getting back on track. Every day is a new day as people take on new roles in our agencies, and TPM is a continual education process. The most important thing is probably a quote passed on to me from a dear friend: whether you're once a trailblazer with your compass, a tracker, or an accelerator, there is a common thread that still relates to TPM, and that is putting a report together is stupid unless you have a discussion about it and discuss strategy and continuous improvement. How am I going to move the needle and not focus on what has happened or has been done in the past? So as we go to the last slide, we can always get better. And I just want to say thank you for your time today. Be safe and be well. Yana, back to you.
All right, thanks,
Thanks,
Tammy.
Tammy.
Oh,
Yeah, no, it's, and I was just gonna say it's over to Matt.
yeah. So thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Yana. We're going to do a little bit of a Q&A for the panel for the webinar, and then we're going to sort of transition into the closing session for the TAM mega meeting. But there are a few questions that came in that I think are are general enough that I think I should ask those now. Basically, I think they're good. The first one is for Nelson. And I think it's applicable to both, states and MPOs and transit agencies as well. And it's, how does FHWA or perhaps US DOT anticipate accommodating unexpected impacts to highway performance target attainment brought on by the pandemic? And I think that could be easily, seen as, we set, very hard targets and we kind of met those because we didn't see the traffic or something like that, or there's such a reduction in overall VMT or demand that, perhaps fatalities or fatality rates or something like that are kind of decreasing. So this is a major shock to the system. Is there any sort of thinking that FHWA is doing or guidance or anything to sort of, address that in some way?
Yeah, right. Hi, Matt. Yeah, good question. And I got to say, there has been plenty of conversations going on in federal highways and working with our partners to sort of get a sense of what's happening out there. At this time, there's no sort of guidance or policy that FHWA has issued concerning this, but I guess sort of rest assured that it's something that Federal Highways is very much aware of and looking at and trying to come up with an appropriate response.
Thanks, Nelson. And I guess for any of the other panelists, any thought to that in terms of how your agency is sort of wrestling with that, with the current situation when it comes to, setting targets? And hearing none, I give it 3 seconds. I will say that people don't. So thanks for that. The next one is for Brian, and it talks a little bit, I think, something that we've been talking about within the TAM mega meeting about asset and data. And the question is, could you talk a little bit about how your agency is handling, I guess, the organization and maintenance of the NPMRDS data? Are you strictly using RIDIS, or did you attempt to calculate the metrics yourselves using raw data?
Yeah, this is a question we wrestled with at the baseline of what to actually do first. And what we actually set on was hiring a consultant to do the calculations for us. They actually developed a Python script to do the calculations for NPM-RDS data and reliability in 2017. Again, coming back to the presentation, we had a little bit of a challenge looking at the NPM-RDS data prior to 2017 because it was a different vendor. They were using NPM-RDS data, was using HERE data. So the calculations for Massachusetts was really wonky. It made it kind of look like things got a lot better on one and kind of the same on the other. So we decided to just go with that one data point. Moving forward, though, we realized that really wasn't a sustainable way to do things. So we are going to proceed with using CATLab RIDIS tool for setting our targets, our 2 and 4 year targets this year. At the very least, we will be using 2017, 2018, 2019, hopefully, INRIX data. There is some discussion about going prior to 2017, and we'd have to discuss with our division office partners about that because obviously, like the NPM RDS data isn't using INRIX prior to that. But yeah, that's our approach this year.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, Susanna, I was going to turn it over to you next, actually. I saw your request.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I was desperately trying to unmute myself and couldn't seem to do it. So Susanna Recht, TPM team lead for Federal Highways, but I just wanted to go back to the prior question that was asked with respect to target setting. So just as kind of a reminder to folks, for the non-safety measures, you know, that's on a biannual process. And so for this mid-period performance report that is coming up October 1, you know, states have the opportunity to change their 4-year target. So if you're anticipating some issues with respect to whatever it may be, COVID or what have you, you can certainly adjust your target. And hopefully you will have already been doing that and working with your partners to do that, right? So so hopefully you'll be prepared to come in and make the changes that you feel are necessary come October 1. There is also an opportunity to cite an extenuating circumstance for not meeting a 2-year target. We are, you know, it's defined in regulation 49109, and it involves like man-made or natural disasters of source. There's a number of criteria that are in 49109. We're trying to make sure that that is all-inclusive to the extent it can be to cover some issues with respect to COVID. So more to come on that. We'll be issuing guidance on significant progress. I hope shortly. We've been working on it for some time and it's under final clearance right now. But I wanted to just kind of emphasize there are some things built within the regulation that exists right now to accommodate states needing to change longer range targets.
Great. Thank you, Susanna. I also want to say thanks to Susanna. She is our other partner when it comes to the TPM pooled fund. FHWA is a big partner in that. So thanks for your contribution and work associated with the pooled fund. The last question that I will end with, and it's about dashboards. It's directed towards David and Brian, but I think many of the panelists, you know, have these dashboards and the visualization. Tammy, you know, showed it, Matt showed it, but could you talk about how your agencies decide on data visualizations or dashboards? Did you develop custom products or use an established software package?
I guess I'll go first. As I mentioned during the presentation, the Met Council is still in the process of developing it. We are really taking it seriously, and it's going to be one of our primary work activities for the upcoming year or two. We're actually kind of interested in hearing what you all are doing as well, but the preliminary sort of thought that we've had is that we'll be using the R-Shiny and or Tableau platforms. And I'll just stop with that and see if you guys have any advice for us, because we could use it.
Trying to learn from each other. Anybody else? Brian, Matt, Tammy?
Yeah, sure, Matt. So, I mean, I think David kind of hit on this a little bit. I think obviously a good first step is always to explore what the successes are that are out there. I think with anything that we do, we lean on other DOTs and seeing what's successful. Particularly for safety, we looked at what other states were doing and then kind of molded it into what we wanted it to be, built it on our own. So we have what's called an impact crash data tool, which analyzes the data and produces output that will form the basis for local and regional safety plan development. It's publicly accessible. It's available to anyone to view the dashboards, query the data, extract the data tables, make reports on a municipal level. In addition to that, we're continuing to make dashboards for our capital investment plan, developing story maps. It seems like people can really, understand the sort of technical jargon that we talk about on a day-to-day basis in the transportation planning world a lot better when you make it a little bit more interactive for them. So we're continuing to move in that direction. And if anybody needs links or anything to stuff like that, I'd be happy to provide it.
I would certainly appreciate that. Yeah.
Matt,
go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, it may be worth mentioning too that this topic of visualization and sort of how we use data is one that arose as a very high interest topic in the last TPM pooled fund. I forgot the we had a get together back last November in
The peer exchange.
The peer exchange. Thank you. One couple days, my brain's a little fried. The peer exchange, yes, thank you. Roads is one of the top topics, and there's definitely a lot of interest on the part of the pooled fund in terms of how do we help DOTs meet the needs in terms of just understanding maybe some of the fundamentals of visualization. There's a lot of tools out there that are all have their pros and cons, and we've used a number of them in our agency. I've used a number of them personally. And they're fine, but I think that there's a lot of an element of storytelling and data analytics, and there's a lot to it that I think that the TPM Pooled Fund is interested in trying to help support agencies as they look to that how to use those tools effectively. So,
great, thanks, Matt. Tammy, anything to add? You're going to be our last person.
We're very simple. We've been using Excel spreadsheets. We spent a ton of money on a product and the company went out of business. So we've migrated back to simple Microsoft Power BI. Tableau is a little bit more expensive. So we're just kind of going low tech and trying to figure out how to combine that with other things to get to the storyboards.
Great, thanks, Tammy. I think there's an acronym for that. It's like KISS, right? Keep it simple and something. Anyways, well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists, David, Brian, Tammy, Matt. I thought it was, and Nelson. I thought it was a great discussion. Thank you again. Thank you very much. There were questions about, can I get copies of the presentation, recordings? Yes, yes, yes. If you go to tpm-portal.com, we will post the recording. You can download the presentations right now in the download area.